You're listening to the Play It Brave podcast. Join Darcy for a wild rummage around in her wit and wisdom. She's a photographer, an educator, and a marketing ninja. Each week, she's going to be teaching you all about creating a life full of mindset, money, and marketing miracles. Listen to real-world experiences and surefire strategies from expert guests, all to keep you focused on your path to success. Think less hand-holding or fist bumps. So stop playing safe. It's time to start playing it brave. Here's your host, Darcy Benincosa.
On today's episode of the Play It Brave podcast, I am so excited to have Erin and Steve, the co-founders of Soak Vision, wedding videographers, world travelers, believers, husband and wife duo, power couple, who are going to have a really honest, open conversation. It might get uncomfortable. Who knows? I'm hoping it does because those are super fun. And we're going to talk a little bit about the wedding industry, creativity, and a lot of what's going on in the world today. So welcome to the Play It Brave podcast. I'm so excited to have you both here.
Oh my gosh.
I'm excited to be here too. That was the most hyped intro I've ever had in my life.
That was a wonderful intro.
Well, you know, I've looked at your work. I always study anybody who's going to bless me with their presence on my podcast so that I'm prepared and understand who I'm communicating with. And the second I popped on your website, it was very clear that you two work well together, that you play a lot of different roles, that you are epic storytellers, and that you're really committed to running a business that I feel represents the world. You know, like you've traveled the world, you have so much representation on your website. When I go on there, I don't just see one cookie cutter love story again and again and again. And I really love that.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, we try to be super intentional. I mean, even as a married couple, we come from different backgrounds. So we want that to be reflected in our work as well. And so we try to be super intentional about the work that we're putting out into the world, and just ensure that it represents our circles and our travels and some of the love stories, the amazing love stories that we've come across. And those love stories are not cookie cutter, you know? So yeah.
I think very few are. It's just the representation we've had in all the magazines and on the blogs make it seem like it is, right? And
absolutely.
It feels like now is sort of an awakening, which we should have had hundreds of years ago, but it's coming a little bit more full out. And I saw you guys, I actually got to know you guys from a video that you had done, and I think it was an IGTV that started to be shared everywhere a couple of weeks ago. Do you guys want to talk a little bit about why you decided to make that video, what it was about? It was about the wedding industry.
Yeah, absolutely. So we put out a video. It was called The State of Diversity within the wedding industry. And what's really funny is we put that video out maybe a day or two before I feel like the internet kind of caught fire and started really moving forward with speaking out about social justice. At the time, the concept of the video was inspired because of so much silence that we just noted as a result of the death of George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, right? So we had in the month of May all this kind of string of deaths, which for our community is not new, but I just saw how the industry was very silent about it. And there was a contrast between the response for lives being lost and what I noted the response was for the burning down of the cathedral in Paris, right?
Yeah.
And when that happened, the entire industry just kind of gathered around together and noted how horrible that loss was, right? And really rallied together to note that and to kind of amplify that. But when it came to the loss of life, it was just silence. And I found that to be incredibly offensive. And so we had to speak out about that and challenge our industry friends to do better.
Yeah.
Do you feel like the video started a conversation that you wanted, or do you feel like it didn't really get the result that you wanted? Do you feel like I know a lot of people are speaking out now.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on, do you feel like it was a slap in the face? Do you feel like it's a publicity stunt? Like, what are you thinking with how you put that video out and what the response was?
Yeah.
Do you feel like people were open and receptive?
Speaking from, I'm not Black, I'm Korean American. So, speaking from, I guess, a perspective that isn't Black, because most of our industry, the photographers, planners, the ones that weren't speaking out, weren't people of color, right? So, when we put out the video, it was really just, we wanted to figure out a way where we can, use our platform and use our influence to really try to make change. And I feel like in that moment, a lot of people were trying to do that. And now I think everyone is doing it, right? Like every company and every corporation is having diversity training and they're hiring different people. Now it's more expected than it was maybe earlier a few months ago. But what our intention was just to let everyone know that we aren't okay with the silence.
Yeah.
And especially at that time, it was very silent. And the people who were speaking out were the ones that were either Black or Latino or brown or Black skinned photographers, planners. And we feel like we had an obligation to do it. Our intent, I would say, was just to be open and to challenge. I think it worked in a sense, but I don't think it was because people were challenged. I think it was more people didn't want to feel like they were going to get called out for not participating in Black Lives Matter movement.
Totally.
So it's almost kind of like a sweet but bitter thing, because we see a lot of people speaking out now, but we do kind of question intent a lot.
Yeah.
Because, I think it is the trendy thing to do, is to come out and speak up and attend the rallies and to, put Black on your your Instagram page. But, is that because of cultural pressure, or is it because you really do feel like this is something that needs to change?
I'd like to add on to what he was saying too. I think that it really was the perfect storm. And like I said, we put this video out, I think, right at the helm of all of this movement and conversation. So I think the video added on to the conversation, and I think pushed the conversation forward for sure. And what I'm seeing is, I'm seeing a lot of people that maybe because of COVID, maybe because the world has slowed pace a bit, but are just paying attention now for the first time. The video of George Floyd and others, I think, was certainly appalling, and maybe has captured the attention and maybe the anger of so many people that were not paying attention before. And my concern is that, yes, to Steve's point, I think there are some that are doing this or speaking out because, at this point, no one wants to be seen or labeled as a racist, right? So we need to speak out. But my bigger concern is that anger is a really hard emotion to hold on to for a long time, right? So I'll just say specifically, white persons and persons that are not Black, if we are just speaking out because we are angry about what we saw, in that video, well, that is not enough to sustain the long-term change that we need. We should be speaking out because my hope is that we now have an awakening that George Floyd was just one of many injustices, right? Yeah. And that it represents a larger problem. And so I'm really hoping that those pieces are being put together. And this is not just a flash in the pan.
Yeah, I agree. I think if we look back at that time, it was a lot of people didn't speak out. then they realized, oh my gosh, everybody's speaking out. I need to take a stand. A lot of people issued big apologies for not speaking out sooner. And then I would say about 60% are, I think, really educating themselves to decide how long-term can I make sure to sustain what is my responsibility as a white person to do. And, I started reading that book, White Fragility. I did not think it would apply to me. Okay, this is going to be a lot of white people's problems, right? Because the liberals of us who have legitimate people of color friends, have lived in different countries. I've had many conversations. I've dated different ethnicities. I was like, this isn't my thing. This is all the people when I used to live in the South who were super ignorant, Confederate flags. They're the problem. Mm-hmm. And as I've read White Fragility, I'm like, excuse my language, oh, fuck. Like, oh my gosh, like so many ahas of my own fragility in these conversations.
Yes.
And I think that so many white people, I just saw like everybody kind of frazzled, like, I'm not racist, but I don't know what to say, right? So people just were so worried about what to say. And that was a question I had like proposed to you for this podcast was, what do people say when they don't know what to say?
Okay.
Where do they start with? I would love both of your perspective on that.
Do you mind if I start with this question?
Go ahead.
So I actually first want to address something that I've noticed in the last few weeks as this conversation has been like elevated. And I've also been doing plenty of discussions and forums as well. I think that white people have to get over the idea that they will not, that they will never say anything offensive or that they won't be wrong. Totally. I think that, that is just a crazy expectation to have. In fact, I think white people need to expect that as they are learning and as they are self-educating, that they will not get it right? Yeah. And that there will be correction along the way. And so, Darcy, you have experience or background in education, as do I. And so we know that when we're teaching our students, right, and we're teaching our students a new concept, they're not going to get it right off the break, and they might make mistakes, and then we correct them. We don't correct them to stop their learning process, but we correct them to move them towards the right direction, right? And so it is the same thing with this conversation, right? If you're just now entering this conversation, if you don't have any lived-in experience as a person, specifically a Black person, then wouldn't it be crazy to expect that you would get it right?
Right?
Yeah,
this is where the fragility comes in.
Exactly.
My sister and I have this phrase that we say to each other every time we're like, I said something wrong again on Instagram. And it's like, stop being so fragile, Karen. That's what we just tell each other. Like, stop being so fragile, Karen. Like, we're going to make mistakes. It's going to happen. Why? How could it not in a topic where it takes your own... It really is unpacking your own work and privilege in an era where you could just not do it. Yes. And that's where I get super very much making strategies and plans. I'm bringing on someone who specializes in helping businesses create a diverse platform when they just have a white person at the head, right? Like so many of us entrepreneurs, photographers, we're the only one running our business. And it's like, how could I know the exact right steps to take, even if I consider myself anti-racist, right? Yes. There's so much to learn and unpack there.
Yes. And one thing I want to add on also is I think there is an expectation that when you are corrected, that you're corrected in a way that takes account of your feelings, that you're corrected in a way that is gentle, right? And so when we really think about it, it's nice if that happens, if a Black person is friendly in their correction. But we really have to think about what is happening in the world, the burden and the grief that Black people are shouldering, and have been shouldering for a very long time. And still in the midst of all of our grief, and in the midst of always bracing for impact, we're still trying to live and enjoy our lives as well, right? And raise our families and that sort of thing. And so, kind of like I said before, it's like living life as a Black person is feeling like you're bracing all the time for impact. You know that something is coming. So you're asking a people group that has endured so much to now cater their correction to fit your emotions, right? And that's an inconsiderate thing to do. You know, you have people being killed and murdered. You know, you have wealth gaps, education gaps, all of these things that have to be considered. But still, in the midst of that, when you make a mistake, I need to make sure that I'm catering my correction in a way that is gentle to you so that you can receive it. And that really has to be an expectation that we just do away with.
It's the way I explained it to help people understand a little was like your friend's dad, let's say your dad dies and I go to the funeral and I am distraught by the death of your father so much that you end up comforting me because I'm upset that your dad died, right? Like you go to a funeral, it's not your funeral, but you're expecting somebody else to treat you very, very gently. You know, I just think it's such a weird, again, it is white fragility.
That is it.
They cannot handle, I cannot handle not having everything just be like handed to me gently in a cupcake or something, right? And I just think, you know, what has surprised me so much is that it's only been a couple of weeks of being AKA making some wrong moves on social media and white people are just exhausted. I'm like, oh my gosh, you're exhausted after 4 weeks. Like this is 400 years, everybody. Like you cannot, I just can't say anything right on social media. So I'm not going to say it all. I'm like, stop being fragile, Karen. Like I just try like hashtag stop being fragile, Karen. Cause it's like, oh my gosh, it's been 4 weeks. It's been legit 4 weeks that you feel that you've been wrong. You know, that's not an adult game we're playing. We got to play this like adults who love each other, who care, and who can really see what's happening. You know, any intelligent adult who really is not afraid of unpacking their own privilege is going to see what's happening and what they need to do it, you know? So
absolutely.
Yeah. Exactly. And I think just, and it speaks to, I feel like, it's almost people don't want to say anything, like you said, because they don't want to say anything wrong. But then again, it's almost as if like, I don't want to be embarrassed to say something and not get it correct. So I'm not going to say it. So it's just interesting to see just a different perspective, you know, like you really care about something, then why would you have any shame to say it? Right. Yeah. But now that it might, and the whole concept of saying something about social injustice or seeing a Black person get killed, if that's controversial to you and if that's going to be embarrassing to say and you don't know if that's going to be right or wrong, then it really does. Again, for me, I do question the intent of it. Yeah. But again, I think everyone is trying. And like Erin said, there needs to be an understanding, you know?
Yeah. I think some people are really trying. And I think some people are tuning out because they can. And I think some people are completely just delusional and they have been, and they're part of the biggest problem. Well, maybe they're not the biggest problem, because I do think intelligent people who are able to unpack their own fragility and have conversations like this, even if they're wrong. Every time I have gone to do a podcast, I'm like, oh my gosh, what if I just sound like the most privileged asshole in the whole entire world? And I'm hoping that I don't. And if I do, I guess that's the best way to learn, because I won't want to do that again, right? I'll be like, oh shit, that was really horrible. What I
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's no learning like learning on the job.
Yeah. That is true. So another question I had is, what are white people still getting wrong about conversations about race? I don't know if we've already unpacked that or if there's anything to add. I know what I have come to see is, one, there are, so my friend, as this was happening, she sort of went through her own awakening last year, and she texted me and she said, Darcy, you are an educator, so you're going to feel like you want to get on and educate about race. This is not really yours to touch. There are many, many Black people who have amazing anti-racist courses, and they're the ones who should be teaching this. And sometimes white people think that everything is theirs to touch, you know, and you might not understand. And that really, that was an amazing piece of advice for me to take in, so that I won't immediately start teaching, because I want to immediately be like, well, kids, here's the history of racism, and here's this. And there's so many better equipped people. So I would love to hear for you, what do you feel like white people get to still keep unpacking or learning about having these kinds of conversations?
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting because Ta-Nehisi Coates, he's a brilliant author, and he also attended Howard University, which is my alma mater.
Oh, awesome.
But he speaks about this often, and I think really what he's getting down to the heart of is that when it comes to Black people, oftentimes white people are not able to apply nuance to our lived-in situations. But when it comes to your own lived-in situations, or situations that you are familiar with, then there's no problem applying nuance. And I guess just to add on to what you were saying, right? I think that, yes, there is a time where white people should be talking to white people about and challenging your ideas, and talking about some of the things that you have learned and your self-education over these last few weeks, right? I think those spaces are absolutely important. But also being self-aware enough, and also being nuanced in your approach enough to understand how you're taking up space. Right, is super important. And I think as white people are used to taking up space with no real regard, right? Because, and I'm just speaking very frankly here, I think societally, you know, you've been trained that everything is yours.
Yep.
Right. And so, yeah, I would just agree with what you're saying. You know, I think as we're doing that self-work, I think also just being mindful of how we're taking up space, and if we could be elevating other voices instead of being the first to speak, right? Yeah. And when is it appropriate to lead in these conversations? You know, I have a friend, she's doing a book club with some of her other white friends, leading on the book White Fragility, right? And I think that's great. But one of my, you know, pieces of feedback to her was, do you have any Black voices in the room? You know, people who have these lived-in experiences and are able to confirm, challenge, you know, thoughts or give insight, you know? And so I just think being nuanced in the way when I say we, white people, I'm not white, but
I hear you. The general,
way that the general population approaches and moves through these conversations is super important.
Yeah, I think that is such an important piece of feedback to take and realize, you know. And we also were sort of talking about, what does real anti-racism look like? I think we're getting familiar with what it looks like on social media. Share the important posts, you know, let people take over your feed, say, you know, write brilliant posts. But in true day-to-day life, when you say to someone, you know, anti-racism, what in your mind are the things that what comes to your mind? What do people need to most know about striving to be anti-racist, like making it a daily part of life?
It's always conversations like this always, because I'm not Black. So, I mean, I always kind of take a step back and allow Erin to be that voice, because I think her voice is the most important voice right now as a Black woman.
Yeah.
But in this question, I do feel like I play a part of it, because I do, as someone that is not Black, and I guess maybe model minority in a way, Asian people leaning more towards the white culture and the white communities. I do feel like the best thing as far as what we can do to be anti-racist is to understand like the little microaggressions that every community has, right? So for example, in the Korean community, I know in this area, there is like a county that's predominantly Black. And in the Asian community, it's Prince George's County. So if you say that you're from Prince George's County, the first thing, the Asian community say is like, oh, you must be like really hood or really ghetto, or you must, just a lot of stereotypes like that. But in a sense, like, even within our own communities and our own cultures, we have these certain microaggressions we have towards the Black community. So to be anti-racist in a context where you might not have a lot of Black friends, or you might not be around a lot of Black or brown people, how do you be anti-racist is to combat racism within your own community, right? So if you hear things like, you're from that Black county, you must be really ghetto. And the first thing, what I would do is say, why would you say something like that? And then they would really need to conceptualize that, hey, I'm saying Black and ghetto or hood or poor all equate to each other. And that, in a sense, is racist. And it might be a microaggression. It might be out of a joke or fun, but it forms and shapes the way you look at Black people on an everyday basis.
Absolutely.
And I just want to add, the Prince George's County is the wealthiest Black county.
Yes, and that's the craziest thing, because Prince George's County is an amazing county. It's the richest county for African Americans. A lot of Black business owners are from Prince George's County. A lot of successful Black people are from Prince George's County. So the only reason why, people in the Asian community living outside and, other predominantly white counties look at Prince George's County and say, hey, you're from Prince George's, you must be ghetto, is because there's a lot of Black people here. But I mean,
so you're equating Blackness
and poor, or Black and ghetto, or Black and thug, and that all comes down to everything we see in like George Floyd, right? Or Ahmaud Arbery. Like, people dehumanize Black people. And within your own community, it's happening every day. It might seem like a fun joke, or it might not seem like a big deal, but that's how it starts, and that's how I would combat racism, or try to promote anti-racism within those communities. Is when you see those microaggressions, is to speak out against it, and to really ask them, and to really have them conceptualize, what do they mean by these things?
Yeah. And I think like what Steve is talking about is for sure one way that you can be practical about how you're anti-racist, right? I think for me as a Black person, if I'm speaking in general terms, to be anti-racist, I'm going to speak in general terms, but also in very practical terms. It means that you're willing to sacrifice something. That's what it means. It means that you are willing to sacrifice either your comfort. It means that you are willing to sacrifice maybe your reputation. It means that you are willing to sacrifice maybe money, opportunities. I mean, and this is just, being honest, right? Like here in America, we have a very huge wealth gap between white Americans and Black Americans. And, do we ever really, I keep saying we, but I guess I should just say white people. Do white people ever stop to think about how that wealth gap was created, right?
Mm-hmm.
How that education gap was created. Why are we living in the conditions that we're living under, right? And what role does history have to play in that? And are we responsible for our history as Americans? And the answer should be yes,
Mm-hmm.
right? The answer should be, even if we as white people, if white people were not involved in slavery and redlining and Jim Crow and mass incarceration or all of these things, right, that serve to keep a people oppressed, you still benefit from it.
Absolutely.
Right? You still benefit from it. And to say, and to look at a community and to say, like, oh yeah, I recognize that there's a wealth gap between Black people and white people. I can recognize that. And if you're able to recognize that, then you have to ask the question why that is. Mm-hmm. And if you're not able to truly ask that question, then you're making an assumption that Black people are less wealthy because of an inherent flaw in Black people, right? Or an inherent flaw in Black children when we talk about education.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so that in itself is racist, right? And so the real thing is, once we have that knowledge, we have to be accountable to that knowledge. Once you understand that there's a wealth gap, you have to be accountable to that knowledge. Once you understand there are education gaps, you have to be accountable to that and really dig into that. And you need to be willing to give up some real estate, mm-hmm. whether that be in comfort or funds or whatever, to make sure that everyone truly has equality, right? And equity is really what we're looking for here. So I hope I answered that question clearly.
That was brilliant. Okay. I have so many thoughts going through my head from, steps that I'm a big influence in my nieces' lives, and they come over to my house, and steps that we've taken have been really to not watch shows or TV that put those blanket statements on Black lives of being thugs or poor or ghetto or all of those things, because they're everywhere, which is how this kind of, it just perpetuates it. You're getting brainwashed slowly and slowly to just be afraid, right, mm-hmm. of people who look different from you. To, some of the hardest conversations that I have are with people who, I live in a very wealthy white neighborhood. Some of my family does as well, who have never left America, never left Utah. Utah is very white, who have never left the comfort of their own community, who went to school, got married, have kids, lawyer husband, and they just haven't ever seen, when I was 24, I went and taught in an inner city school in Florida, and it was 98% Black population. And that was the biggest eye-opener of the injustice of our educational system. And I was, I know it's like hard when white people get shocked because you're like, we've known this forever. And so I try and not be shocked about it. But at 24, I was very shocked at the racism that existed in the whole entire state of Florida. Florida is just a shit show anyway, but like teaching there, I couldn't get access to books, where my friend at the same time was teaching English at a school 5 miles away to a wealthy white subdivision. And she had every single effing luxury. And I was like, how can anybody get ahead with this kind of race? How can anybody, and by race, like running a race, right? So yes. I think it's so important. And I really do think there are people who are getting it. And then I think there are people who haven't quite gotten it yet and need to hear this conversation again and again and again. When you talk about like ending oppression and giving up your comfortable, that space of feeling comfortable. Nobody grows, nobody changes in your comfort zone at all. No. So I'm really glad you talked about the microaggressions, because I think a lot of people haven't really heard that word. And I think those are sometimes, we can all see when we watch the video of George Floyd, we can see it, right?
Yes.
But microaggressions, I think so many people are really blind to these tiny things that continue to create that disease in society of white supremacy, right? So it's really important. Do you have any, I wonder, well, we could put this in the show notes, but if you have any good resources, I would love, your greatest resources or book recommendations for people to continue to have this kind of conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually have a ton of resources, so I'll try to give like one of each. There's a podcast called Code Switch by NPR that I think is great. And they have very honest conversations about race, about Black Lives Matters, and about the state of Black people. So I think that would be a great podcast to listen to. There are tons of books by Black authors. I would say if you're interested in anti-racism, you should look at How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibrahim Kendi. There is So You Want to Talk About Race, right? If you are interested in learning about white privilege, you have The White Fragility. You also have a book by Layla, I forgot her last name, Saeed, I believe is her name, and it's called Me and White Supremacy. That book is a book that will take you through some of these heavier topics in a reflection type of style where you're able to journal and really do the introspection work that you need to do. And she does not mince words, and it is not for the fragile. So maybe you need to read White Fragility first before you do that book.
It'll be the stepping stone so we can handle the other one. Okay.
Absolutely. And then there are just like so many movies that you can watch as well. You have I'm Not Your Negro. You have Selma. You have 13th, which talks about mass incarceration. I mean, there literally are endless, and I can add on to this list, and this is something that I can give to you for the show notes.
Perfect.
But so many resources. I wanted to talk about microaggressions too, and like why that word is so important, because I think for the white moderate, right, or what we would call the white liberal today, and I think this is something you touched on a little bit in the beginning, I think that there is a section of our society that is able to function in this blind spot, right, where it's like, I am not blatantly racist, so I must not be racist, right? I have Black friends, I have Black coworkers, I may even have a Black spouse, my proximity to Blackness cancels out my ability to be racist. That's kind of the thought behind the white liberal.
I have been guilty of that thought.
Or the white moderate, which I just want to say that you can totally be married to or in relationship to a Black person and still be racist. Unknowingly, it doesn't always have to be intentful. But what I want white people to know also is being racist doesn't necessarily have anything to do with intent. It has everything to do with impact, right? So I think for white people, they often think, well, I am not blatantly racist, and it is never my intent to be racist. So I think when they are called out on something that is offensive, oppressive, or racist, I think it feels like a direct attack on their personal character. And so I think we have to be clear about this idea. Being racist has nothing to do with your intention, everything to do with your impact. So if you are the white liberal and you do recognize that there are, schools, around the block from you that are not receiving proper funding, right? And you think to yourself, or maybe you don't think to yourself anything about it. You know, maybe you just think to yourself like, oh man, those kids are maybe not as hardworking, or, you know, whatever the thought is that you have in passing. Well, that is still racist.
Yeah.
You know, maybe you're on the train, and I've seen this happen where there's a group of, you know, Black inner city kids that will get on the train, and I've seen this, and maybe they're loud, right? And maybe you feel inconvenienced by the fact that they're loud, right? And you make a comment in your head like, oh, these kids from the hood, or these kids from the ghetto. But you don't ever stop to think and reflect about how your behavior has created their conditions.
Exactly.
Right? And I think for, you know, in that particular situation, you know, I remember thinking to myself, like, how dare these people be or feel inconvenienced by these loud children and not take any responsibility for the ways that they have gentrified their communities, for the ways that white people historically have created the ghetto. You have created, redlining created what we consider ghettos in America, right? Redline created situations where children don't have proper access to education. And so for you to criticize the behavior and the culture of people because you feel like it's uncomfortable to you, but you're not taking any accountability for the ways that you help to create these situations and the ways that you benefit from having a class underneath you, right? That's not okay. You know, that is not okay. So, you know, a lot of times when we're talking about microaggressions, I think a lot of the conversation has been very surface level. It has been about, you know, the ways that we'll comment on Black women's hair, or the ways that we might say in passing, like, oh, like, you know, that's so ghetto. We might, you know, say or make these comments. But I really want to challenge us to think about microaggressions in the ways that we think, because before we speak or say anything, everything starts as a thought. How are we positioning our thoughts around people who live differently than us, you know? And before we are judgmental or uncomfortable, I think white people should always be in the position of thinking, and this is where the self-learning comes in, how do I play a part? How have I played a part in creating what I'm seeing, right? I think that is very important. So our jerk reaction should always be self-reflection, you know, for sure. And I think, I hope I'm not all over the place here, but
no,
also
you're making perfect sense.
Also just like being able to, you know, going back to that conversation about correction, like you have to expect that you do not know everything about other people's cultures and other people's experiences. And that's totally okay. But when you make a comment or have a thought or whatever that has a negative impact on a Black person or a person of color, you have to take responsibility for that. You cannot see that as a personal attack, but instead you should see that as a space where you have more learning to do. Right? A space where you can take it upon yourself to learn more. And so, you know, white people, we can't, I keep saying we, but white people cannot be victims, you know, in this conversation. You have to keep the placement where it belongs. You know, that's so interesting that I, you know, we can also talk about the ways that Black people try to make white people feel comfortable.
Right.
And one of those ways for me is, you know, I learned to say we so that people don't feel targeted. Right?
Totally.
So here I am very clearly talking about white people as a Black person. And I'm saying, you know, we need to accept responsibility. But the truth is, no, this is something that white people need to take upon themselves. And I think Black people, we have to divest ourselves from trying to coddle and make white people feel comfortable.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. It gets too exhausting, and it's like, it's not your job, that's not your job. So outside of protesting, donating money, what do you feel white people could be doing now? But, obviously voting, getting informed, educating, to be more accountable when school systems are different? Is it to go out and take a bigger voice in obviously the voting process, but do you have this is a really open-ended question, but do you have any thoughts of actions people can take outside of what we're currently seeing people do? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Did you want to lead, or you want to give that to me?
I'm thinking. I'm in the same boat as.
I honestly, my response to that is, I feel like the actions that I'm seeing right now I'm inspired by them. I'm empowered by them. I think they're beautiful because what I'm seeing, at least in the area that I live in, Washington, D.C., I'm seeing people really be intentional about trying to use all of their modalities to be inclusive, diverse, and to break down the systems of racism. So I see people restructuring their businesses. Yeah. I see people protesting. I see people having tough conversations with their friends and family, which is so important and cannot be understated. In fact, I think having those conversations is probably what needs to be ongoing because, as a white person, you have privilege into spaces that I, as a Black person, do not. If you're sitting at your Thanksgiving table with your uncle, he would say something, he would feel comfortable maybe to say something inappropriate in front of you, whereas he would not in front of me. Right. So truly challenging, having those challenging conversations is important. I see all of that happening. I think, and also I see a lot of self-educating happening.
Yeah.
What I want to challenge white people to do and what they should do more of is, one, please make sure that the leading voices are people who have been doing this for a long time, Black people, right? So as we are learning more, here I am with we again, as white people are learning more and self-educating, please ensure that you are now giving space for a Black person or a Black organization to continue to lead, and you're continuing to learn, and you're not so eager to sit in the role of the teacher, right?
Totally.
In spaces where that's not appropriate. I think that's one. But then two, I would challenge white people to think of this as a long-term game. And I see so much traction right now, and I think that's beautiful. But circling back around to the conversation that we're having earlier, anger can only fuel you for so long, right? Yeah. And so this has to truly be a deep-seated cause that you're committed to for a long period of time. So I think that is something that I would like to see and hear white people talk more about. How do I plan to sustain this over a long period of time? This is not just about me putting out a statement, about how I've added 5 new, Black employees to my business and now I'm done. Yeah. I think it's great that we're making space for Black people to be included, and people are restructuring. But now that the Black people are there, how are you going to ensure that their voice is heard, that they feel comfortable to be authentic, right? Because one thing that we know too is being a Black person in a space does not necessarily guarantee that that space is safe.
Exactly.
Right? It doesn't guarantee that you're truly able to be authentic. And many Black people in spaces, workspaces, have to code switch. They have to put on a mask, if you will. Right? They have to speak the language that makes white people feel most comfortable, and behave in ways and dress in ways and do our hair in ways that makes white people feel most comfortable if we want to keep that spot, right? If we want to stay in that spot. And so just beyond doing the visible work, there needs to be a continued inner work and a deeper work that needs to continue. And those are the conversations that I want to see happening. Beyond just the surface, how are we going to continue to dig into this? Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. What is our plan to impact not just our immediate circles, but circles maybe beyond? Because, yes, maybe you and your 4 friends are on this whole anti-racist bandwagon, right? But beyond you and your circle, how are you impacting others beyond your circle and challenging others beyond your circle? And so that's really important to think about.
Yeah, that gave me a lot to think about, a lot of, what I want for my business, for my life, for my niece's life, for my, family, for the conversations, for friends, for the world, for everything that we're doing. So that was a perfect, white people have work to do.
Yeah, there's work to do for sure.
And that's okay. I got a lot of homework. You and I were in education. I'm ready to get my PhD in anti-racism. And, we have to just show up and do something every day. It's not going to, I hope it stays at this space. A few weeks ago, it was like every hour of every day I was watching something, doing something. And it's like, that's not sustainable. But what is sustainable is dedicated time every week to my own education, always evaluating my business, seeing how I'm showing up in certain situations. What kind of conversations am I having? What kind of conversations am I overhearing within my own circle? I think it's a commitment. It's a commitment to your own education. Yeah.
And being intentional too. I know you mentioned living in Utah and there's maybe not much access to, Black people in that area where you live specifically. And I think so being intentional about reaching out to, Black people, kind of how you're doing, right?
Yeah.
And creating those connections is super important as well. And especially if you're in a place where, it's homogenous and you're not getting varied, lived in experiences and you're not able to glean from that, then even more so it's important to do the work, to read and to watch and to listen and to reach out. That's super important to do. And to, not just leaning on that one Black person, but gaining a varied, perspective about the Black experience.
Yeah.
Because just, again, I want to make this point, just because you have one Black friend or you have your Black spouse or whatever does not mean that you are non-racist.
Yeah.
It does not mean that the world is completely united, and I want to be clear also that Black people have had to assimilate to white culture for survival. Yeah. And so you will come across some Black people that are not interested in any part of this conversation. Yeah. And they are totally fine with the status quo as long as themselves as individuals are not impacted, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why it's also important to have that varied gaining those varied perspectives and voices, just to get a pulse on the collective.
Yeah.
So important.
I unfriended someone. I don't even know how I got friends with her. And maybe I shouldn't have unfriended, but it was just like, no, I don't even want to deal with this, this white lady. And she just had like all these videos of certain times famous people have said racism doesn't exist and they're Black or something like that. And I just was like, whatever you look for, you're going to try and find a justification for your own way to stay how you are. And that's where I was, again, I don't want to say I was shocked, but I'm like, okay, there are so many different sides to this conversation. And right now we're all making the decision of what side of history and what side of the conversation we're going to be on. And to kind of bring this full circle, I'm sure that is why when you witnessed so many people not speaking out, it was because what was so different? Black people have been being murdered forever, whatever it was happening. And I think that woke a lot of white people up, myself included, who, you know, I may have had some of these conversations with people, but I wasn't using my platform for them in the way that I now see that I can.
Yeah.
And people can't be in the gray. They can't not make a decision right now.
No.
And not making a decision, not speaking out, not doing those things, that's you making a decision. And that's the side that you're going to be on. But I think it's very important right now, more than ever, and for continuing on forever, to really be part of the solution and
Absolutely.
unpack your own, not you, me.
It's not we.
Not we.
Me.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Me and every white person, you know.
Yes. And every white aligning, honestly,
non-white, non-black
persons, because even, and I can't even say non-black persons, really, this is very specific to African American, Black indigenous persons, right? Persons whose ancestors were slaves and built the wealth of this country. Because you can have some Black people who immigrated here that have a whole separate history.
Exactly.
And they may not understand what is happening in the African American community because they don't have that shared history, right?
Yeah.
Which again goes back to having those varied voices and understanding what you're hearing and being able to break down, why you're hearing what you're hearing, right? So that is super important. And I don't mean to jump, but this is one point that I also want to make too, going back to your question about what is one thing that white people need to be aware of. I think that has always been like this push whenever there has been a tragedy in the Black community at the hands of white people. Mm-hmm. There's been this push for like unity, right? Like white people will say like, well, we don't need to be divisive. We need to be united right now. Like you see these kind of conversations happening often on political stages, on religious stages, and in the American church. We can't be divisive over race. We have to be united in Christ, right? Mm-hmm. Or just in these different spaces. I think in our wedding industry, one way that we see that being used is when we see these images, again, of like maybe a Black person and a white person together, right? Mm-hmm. Often to represent unity. And while, yes, we live in a multicultural society, and that is a beautiful thing, and I think that is a beacon of hope for unity for sure. When people look at couples like Steve and myself as a multiracial couple, I think people can see the unity in that, and that can be a beautiful thing. But the real truth is that there is no unity if lives aren't valued, right?
Exactly.
So we're trying to rush this conversation of unity because we're truly uncomfortable with talking about the real issues, right? Then there's a problem there. And I think white people in America and probably globally, I'm not sure, but I know for sure here in America, there is this push to kind of talk about how we're all the same.
Yeah. Or I don't see color.
I don't see color. Oh, gosh.
I had somebody say that, and then that was all they said. And this was somebody I've invested money in their product. And I was like, that's all she's saying. That's it. That's all she said. I don't see color. That was
which is incredibly offensive.
It's a cop-out.
Right?
It's incredibly offensive. Yeah. It excuses them. And they're the white liberal person that's like, I'm not racist. I don't see color. And I just think you're the problem.
Yeah. But how could you look at me and not see my color? How could you look at him and not see, like.
It's privileged to be colorblind.
It is
to have that kind of mentality.
Yeah.
It's a very privileged thing.
It's a dangerous mentality.
Yeah. And it speaks to the issue. For anyone to say that I don't see color, that is the whole issue of it. Because it's almost like it's an arrogance ignorant, like you're how do you say, like you're arrogantly ignorant.
Yeah.
Right? Like you're
and it's
saying
almost
that
like
I don't,
willful.
yeah, it's like I don't see colorblind because I don't want to see it. However, people who are of color, we have no choice. I can't, I mean, especially for the Black community, but even speaking for like Asians, like there's definitely situations where I know that I am the only Asian person in the room.
Yeah.
And I wish I could be like, oh, everybody doesn't see color. We're fine, but I know that when I walk into a room, 95% of the chance I may be like one or the two Asian people there. So I mean, it's not something that people of color have the luxury to say.
Yeah. And then as a Black person, specifically somebody I'm brown skinned, right? Like I'm not an ambiguous looking Black person. I am a Black woman, visibly a Black woman, right? So when I walk into a space, I have this duality to me that I'm always living my life in this dual space, right? Understanding that and being aware of how I move in certain spaces, right? So if I'm hanging out with my family, I feel completely free to be my true authentic self.
Yeah.
But if I am the only Black person in a space of white people, then I'm very aware of that. And also part of my survival technique, right, is to do what I need to do to be disarming, right? So that means that I'm speaking in a tone that is maybe not offensive or comforting to white people, right? That means that I am talking about things that maybe I think white people can relate to, which also means that I have to know what interests you.
Trevor knows that's just the dogs. White people's obsession with their dogs.
Okay, just the dogs.
Like Trevor knows, like white people are obsessed with their dogs. Just talk to him about that.
Yeah, right. But it means that I have to know your history and my history. I have to know what you're interested in, but also have a pulse on my culture, right?
Yeah.
I have to know how you perceive me, but also like all of these dualities that I have to know because I'm a Black woman moving in this world.
Yeah.
I have to know how you perceive me because I have to be able to move, right? In a non-threatening way. And so, I mean, this whole idea of colorblindness is just absurd. But also, I think that maybe it is coming from a place of wanting to, again, be like unified, right? And maybe it's coming from a good place, but again, we have to understand impact over intent. And I would say in closing, we have to be comfortable talking about our differences. And I think as Americans, oftentimes when we think about differences, when it comes to race specifically, we are looking at it from a deficit point of view. And we're not able to talk about it from a point of view where our differences bring value. And so because we see it in a deficit point of view and we don't really want to address it, we don't. Yeah. We focus on how we're all the same, right? And so that starts from childhood.
Yeah.
Right? That starts from childhood. We teach kids, you don't see color, that's the good thing to do. You don't see color. And now what happens is we have a group of adults that we can visibly see now that are very uncomfortable and fumbling over this conversation about race and color, and that are completely shocked that they have Black friends, they have Black spouses, they have Black people that are dear and close to them, and they had no idea that this Black person that is so close to me literally walks the world in a completely different way than I walk through the world. Yeah. And that's because we like to focus on how we're the same. We like to focus on the fact we have similar hobbies, and we like to go on vacation together to similar places, but we don't focus on our differences.
Yeah.
And so we have to be able to focus on our differences, not from a place of them being a deficit, but being able to frame and talk about our differences and how they bring value to us. And I'll just end with this one example. When I'm teaching in my classroom, and in my school, I have children of many various backgrounds, and they speak various languages, right? So I'll do this diversity activity with them, and they're in 3rd grade. And so I'll say, okay, class, how do we greet somebody? And they'll say, well, you say hello. And I'll say, is that the only way that you can greet someone? You know, like, look around this class, look at all the different cultures that we have and the languages that we can speak. Is hello in English, is that the only way that we can greet someone? And they'll say, well, no, like, in my language, we say it this way. So we then break into groups. The kids will teach each other how to say hello in their various languages. And then at the end of the activity, the kids now know how to greet one another in like 5 to 6 different languages, right? Mm-hmm. And then we say, well, what if we just focused on how we were all the same? Will we then know how to speak all these different languages and greet each other in these different languages? No, we wouldn't. But because we focused on how we're different and the value that that brings to us as a class, now we all know more, right? And now we can all connect to each other on a deeper level because we sat in those differences. We recognize them as valuable, right? Yeah. And that's a really important thing that I think can be also applied to adults, right?
Oh, completely. Yeah. Adults need a lot more elementary education. It's these simple things. I'm so glad that you are a teacher. I can see in everything that you explained that you have greatly educated me today and the listeners. And I agree with you. Life will be so much more rich when we're not all chasing this unity dream. We're accepting the differences and we're standing up for equality, in every form that looks like. And it doesn't mean we all have to be the same, but it does mean that we do have to have those rights to walk around like you and feel safe in the country that you live in.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's huge. Thank you both for joining me. This was an incredible conversation. I'm deeply grateful that you came on and had so many amazing takeaways for myself and for all the white listeners. I think it's been brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you for using your platform to have us on and create space for us. And you're elevating, you're amplifying Black voices. And I appreciate that. So thank you for doing the self-work.
I'm trying. I got to try harder, but I'm in it. I'm in it for the long haul.
That's encouraging.
Thank you both. Thank you so much to Erin and Steve for joining me. Please make sure to check out the show notes for all of the resources that Erin mentioned, along with the summary of what we talked about today. I don't know about you, but for me, the part that made the absolute most impact was when Erin was talking about intention versus impact. So yes, it made an impact, but no white person, liberal white person is intending to be racist. And we really do have to work through our own fragility in thinking that anybody is attacking our character and truly start understanding the impact of our actions, of the system that we are all living in, of the words that we speak, and doing our part through our own education, through taking more part in situations where we can have a strong voice, where we can make a difference. White people, you got to understand, you can make a huge difference. I can make a huge difference. And it is a lifelong commitment. And I just want to thank Erin and Steve so much for their time and their intelligence and for coming here and educating each of us to become better than we are. And that's the whole goal of life. And right now, it's what America needs. So thank you for joining me on the Play It Brave podcast.
You've been listening to the Play It Brave podcast. Love what you heard? Wonderful. You can shout about it in the reviews. I bet you know someone who needs a shot of self-belief. Then don't keep us a secret. If you've missed something crucial, we've got show notes for this and all past episodes over at darcybenincosa.com/play it brave. Thanks for tuning in, but don't forget, the world teaches you to play it safe. Stand up, stand out, and start playing it brave.